Welcome to Sleepless History. I'm your host, and tonight we're going to explore one of the most transformative events in American history, the California Gold Rush. Over the next 2 hours, we'll journey through the years 1848 to 1855, examining in detail how the discovery of gold in a remote California mill race changed the course of a nation and the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. So settle in, get comfortable, and let us guide you through this fascinating period of American expansion, ambition, and transformation. If you enjoy tonight's episode, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel more than you may think. Part 1. The Land Before Gold. To understand the California Gold Rush, we must first understand California itself before that fateful day in January 1848. California in the early 1840s was a place that existed on the margins of the American consciousness. It was a remote, sparsely populated territory that had only recently come under United States control following the Mexican-American War. The land that would become California had been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Over 300,000 Native Americans lived in the region, speaking more than 100 different languages and dialects. These were the Miwok, the Maidu, the Yokuts, the Ohlone, and countless other tribes who had developed sophisticated societies adapted to the diverse landscapes of California, from the coastal regions to the Great Central Valley to the Sierra Nevada mountains. The first European contact came with Spanish explorers in the 16th century. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed along the California coast in 1542, claiming the land for Spain. But it wasn't until the late 1700s that Spain began to establish a permanent presence in California through a system of missions, presidios, and pueblos. The mission system, established beginning in 1769 with Mission San Diego de Alcala, would eventually grow to 21 missions stretching from San Diego to Sonoma. These missions were founded by Franciscan friars, most notably Junipero Serra, with the stated goal of converting the indigenous population to Catholicism and incorporating them into Spanish colonial society. The reality of mission life for Native Americans was often harsh. They were forced to abandon their traditional ways of life, subjected to diseases for which they had no immunity, and made to work in conditions that resembled slavery in all but name. By 1821, Mexico had won its independence from Spain, and California became a territory of the new Mexican nation. The Mexican period in California, lasting from 1821 to 1846, saw significant changes. The mission system was secularized in 1833, with mission lands supposedly to be distributed among Native Americans. In practice, these lands were largely claimed by Mexican settlers and administrators, leading to the development of vast ranchos. The rancho system created a kind of pastoral society in California. Large land grants, sometimes encompassing hundreds of thousands of acres, were given to prominent families. These ranchos raised cattle primarily for their hides and tallow, which were traded with American and European ships that began visiting California ports with increasing frequency. Life on the ranchos was often romanticized in later years, portrayed as an idyllic period of California culture, with grand fiestas, skilled horsemanship, and a leisurely aristocratic lifestyle. American interest in California grew throughout the 1830s and early 1840s. Traders, mountain men, and settlers began arriving in small numbers, drawn by tales of California's mild climate and fertile lands. Among these early American arrivals was John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant who would play a crucial role in the events to come. John Augustus Sutter arrived in California in 1839. He was a man with a complicated past, having left Switzerland under somewhat mysterious circumstances, possibly fleeing debts or legal troubles. But in California, he reinvented himself as a man of ambition and vision. He obtained a land grant from the Mexican governor of California, 48,000 acres in the Central Valley, near the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers. Sutter established what he called New Helvetia, with his headquarters at Sutter's Fort in what is now Sacramento. He envisioned creating a kind of empire in the wilderness, an agricultural and trading center that would serve as a gateway to California's interior. Sutter's Fort became a crucial stopping point for American immigrants entering California over the Sierra Nevada mountains. He employed Native Americans, Hawaiians, and European immigrants in his various enterprises, which included farming, ranching, and trade. The Mexican-American War, which began in 1846, would dramatically change California's status. The conflict had multiple causes, including disputes over the Texas border, following Texas's annexation by the United States, and American territorial ambitions that encompassed not just California, but much of what is now the American Southwest. The concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the North American continent, provided ideological justification for this expansion. In California, the conflict played out in a somewhat peculiar fashion. The Bear Flag Revolt in June 1846 saw American settlers in Northern California declare independence from Mexico and establish the California Republic. This republic was short-lived, as American military forces under Commodore John Sloat claimed California for the United States just weeks later. The war with Mexico concluded with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2nd, 1848. Under its terms, Mexico ceded California and much of the Southwest to the United States in exchange for $15 million and the assumption of certain debts. The treaty guaranteed property rights for Mexican citizens living in the ceded territories and promised them the full rights of American citizenship. At the time the treaty was signed, few in the United States government or the American public paid much attention to California. It was viewed as a distant, sparsely populated region of uncertain value. Some questioned whether the territory was worth the cost of the war. The population of non-indigenous people in California in early 1848 was probably less than 15,000, scattered across the vast territory. But even as diplomats were putting the final touches on the treaty that would transfer California to the United States, events were already in motion that would transform California and capture the imagination of the entire world. In the American River, at a sawmill being built for John Sutter, something extraordinary was about to be discovered. Part 2. The Discovery at Sutter's Mill. January 24th, 1848. This date would become one of the most significant in California history, though its importance would not be immediately apparent to those present. On this Monday morning, in the tail race of a sawmill under construction on the South Fork of the American River, a carpenter named James Wilson Marshall made a discovery that would change the world. Marshall was an interesting character, a carpenter and wheelwright from New Jersey who had made his way to California in 1845. He had worked at Sutter's fort and had entered into a partnership with Sutter to build a sawmill in the Sierra Nevada foothills. The location chosen was in a valley the Maidu Indians called Columa, about 45 miles northeast of Sutter's fort. The sawmill would provide lumber for Sutter's growing agricultural empire and for the increasing number of American settlers arriving in California. Construction of the sawmill began in late 1847. Marshall supervised a crew that included local Maidu Indians, Mormons who had recently arrived in California with the Mormon Battalion, and other labourers. The work progressed through the fall and winter, with the crew excavating a mill race to channel water from the American River to power the sawmill's machinery. Marshall was a meticulous man, some said eccentric and difficult to work with. He had a habit of inspecting the mill race each morning, after the water had run through it overnight, checking on the progress of the excavation and looking for any problems. On the morning of January 24th, as he walked along the tail race, something caught his eye in the shallow water. What Marshall saw were small flakes and nuggets of a yellow metal resting among the rocks and gravel. He picked up a few pieces and examined them. The metal was malleable, soft enough to be shaped between his fingers. It had a distinctive weight and luster. Marshall had some knowledge of minerals from his work as a carpenter and wheelwright, and he began to suspect what this metal might be. He called to the workers to shut off the water to the mill race and gathered several of the largest pieces of the metal. He then showed them to the crew members. The workers were excited but uncertain. Could this really be gold? Marshall decided to conduct some tests. He hammered one of the larger pieces between two rocks. Unlike pyrite or fool's gold, which would shatter, this metal flattened under the blows, a property of genuine gold. Still, Marshall wanted to be certain before raising any alarms. He decided to take his specimens to Sutter's fort to consult with John Sutter himself. The journey of about 45 miles took Marshall through the Sierra foothills and down to the valley. He arrived at Sutter's fort on a rainy afternoon, requesting a private meeting with Sutter. In Sutter's office, with the door locked and windows secured, Marshall showed Sutter the metal he had found. Sutter later recalled that Marshall was in an agitated state, both excited and anxious about the discovery. Together, they consulted an encyclopedia entry on gold and conducted various tests. The specific gravity test using water and scales, the nitric acid test to check if the metal would corrode, and close examination of the physical properties. All tests confirmed what Marshall suspected. This was genuine gold, and based on its purity, it was of excellent quality. Sutter's reaction to this news was complex and, in retrospect, quite prescient. While he understood the potential value of the discovery, he also immediately grasped the dangers it posed. Sutter's entire enterprise at New Helvetia depended on having reliable workers for his farms, ranches, and mills. If word got out about gold, he feared his workers would abandon their posts to search for it. Moreover, the land where the gold was found was not technically his property, and a gold rush could lead to chaos and legal disputes. Sutter and Marshall agreed to try to keep the discovery secret, at least temporarily. Sutter rode out to the sawmill to see the site for himself and to swear the workers to secrecy. He offered them bonuses and incentives to continue their work and keep quiet about what had been found. For a few weeks, the secret held. Though workers at the mill continued to find gold in their spare time, accumulating small collections of nuggets and flakes. But secrets, especially secrets of such magnitude, rarely stay secret for long. Workers wrote letters to family members. Travelers passed through the area and noticed unusual activity. Small amounts of gold began appearing in transactions at Sutter's fort and in nearby settlements. By February, rumors were spreading through California that gold had been found near Sutter's mill. Still, these early rumors did not immediately create a frenzy. California in early 1848 was isolated from the rest of the United States. News traveled slowly, by ship around Cape Horn or by overland routes that took weeks or months. Many people who heard the rumors were skeptical. Gold discoveries had been announced before in various parts of the world, and they had often turned out to be exaggerated or false. The man who would transform these rumors into a full-fledged gold rush was Sam Brannan, a Mormon elder who ran a store at Sutter's Fort. Brannan was an entrepreneur and promoter who immediately saw the potential in the gold discovery. In May 1848, he made a trip to the sawmill area and confirmed the presence of gold for himself. He then returned to San Francisco, which was still a small settlement called Yerba Buena, with a population of only about 800 people. On May 12, 1848, Sam Brannan walked through the streets of San Francisco, holding a bottle filled with gold dust, shouting, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." His demonstration had an electrifying effect. Within days, San Francisco was nearly deserted as virtually every able-bodied man left for the gold fields. Shops closed. Newspapers suspended publication for lack of staff. Ships were abandoned in the harbour as crews departed for the mines. The initial gold rush was a local California phenomenon. Men came from San Francisco, from Monterey, from the scattered ranches and settlements throughout California. They came from the American military garrisons that had been established during the Mexican-American War. Soldiers deserted in large numbers, despite the threat of severe punishment, unable to resist the lure of gold. Ships arriving in California ports found their crews departing as soon as they dropped anchor. These first gold seekers, arriving in the spring and summer of 1848, found gold in abundance. The early methods of gold recovery were simple. The most common technique was panning, using a shallow pan to swirl gravel and water, allowing the heavier gold to settle to the bottom while lighter materials were washed away. Prospectors also used rockers or cradles, wooden devices that allowed larger amounts of gravel to be processed more efficiently. The gold was primarily found in two forms: placer gold, which consisted of loose flakes and nuggets that had eroded from the original ore deposits and been transported by rivers and streams, and lode or vein gold, which remained locked in quartz or other rock formations. The placer deposits were easier to work and became the focus of the early gold rush. Stories began to circulate of men finding extraordinary amounts of gold. There were reports of miners collecting thousands of dollars worth of gold in a single day, of nuggets the size of eggs or even larger. While some of these tales were undoubtedly exaggerated, the reality was that in those early months, gold was remarkably accessible to anyone willing to work for it. The news spread gradually beyond California. Ships carrying gold and letters describing the discoveries began arriving at ports in Oregon, Hawaii, and Mexico. By late summer, reports were reaching the eastern United States. Though many remained skeptical, the editor of the New York Herald dismissed the stories as a sham got up to guzzle the gullible. Everything changed in December 1848 when President James K. Polk addressed Congress. In his State of the Union message, Polk confirmed the gold discoveries, stating that the accounts of the abundance of gold in that territory are of such extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by the authentic reports of officers in the public service. Shortly after, a messenger arrived in Washington carrying a tea caddy containing 230 ounces of California gold, physical proof of the discoveries. Polk's confirmation gave official credence to the gold rush. Newspapers across the country and around the world picked up the story. The rush was no longer just a California phenomenon. It was about to become global. Part 3. The 49ers. The Great Migration begins. 1849. This would be the year that gave its name to the largest and most famous wave of gold seekers, the 49ers. Following President Polk's confirmation of the gold discoveries and the arrival of California gold in the eastern states, a fever gripped the nation and much of the world. Hundreds of thousands of people from diverse backgrounds and nations decided to abandon their homes, their families, and their established lives to seek fortune in California. The sheer scale of this migration was unprecedented in American history. In 1848, California's non-indigenous population was probably around 15,000. By the end of 1849, it had swollen to over 100,000. Within a few years, it would exceed 300,000. Never before had so many people moved so far, so quickly, driven by a single purpose. Who were these gold seekers? They came from every walk of life. There were farmers from Ohio and Missouri, sailors from Massachusetts, merchants from New York, adventurers from Europe, prospectors from South America. There were young men seeking fortune and adventure, family men desperate to improve their economic circumstances, failed businessmen hoping for a fresh start, and criminals fleeing the law. They were literate and illiterate, rich and poor, experienced frontiersmen and city dwellers who had never spent a night outdoors. What united them was a dream of wealth and opportunity. In the established cities of the East, economic opportunities seemed limited by social class, family connections, and capital. California offered something different, the promise that anyone, regardless of background, could strike it rich through their own labor and luck. It was a profoundly democratic dream, even if the reality would prove more complicated. For those living in the eastern United States, there were three main routes to California, each with its own challenges, costs, and dangers. The choice of route often depended on one's resources, location, and tolerance for risk. The sea route around Cape Horn was the longest, but in some ways the most straightforward. Ships departed from eastern ports, particularly New York and Boston, sailed down the Atlantic coast of South America, rounded the treacherous Cape Horn at the southern tip of the continent, then sailed up the Pacific coast to San Francisco. The journey covered approximately 18,000 miles and typically took 5 to 8 months, depending on weather conditions and the speed of the ship. The Cape Horn route had advantages. Passengers could bring more equipment and supplies than they could carry overland. They didn't have to worry about hostile Indians or desert crossings. For those who could afford cabin passage, the journey could be relatively comfortable, though tedious. But there were significant drawbacks. The passage around Cape Horn was notoriously dangerous, with violent storms, mountainous waves, and the constant threat of shipwreck. Many ships were lost in these waters. Even for those who survived, seasickness, boredom, bad food, and close quarters made the months-long voyage an ordeal. The cost was also substantial. Cabin passage could cost $200 to $500, more than many workers earned in a year. Steerage passage was cheaper, but meant enduring crowded, unsanitary conditions below decks. The demand for passage to California was so great that almost anything that could float was pressed into service. Aging ships that should have been scrapped were refitted and declared seaworthy. Overcrowding was common, with ships designed to carry 50 passengers departing with 200 or more. Not all would reach California. Some ships sank, others had to turn back due to damage or disease outbreaks, and a few were caught in doldrums, running short of food and water. The second sea route was somewhat shorter, travelling by ship to the Isthmus of Panama, crossing overland through the jungle, and then catching another ship on the Pacific side to San Francisco. This Panama route could theoretically be completed in as little as 6 to 8 weeks, making it attractive to those in a hurry. The reality of the Panama crossing was harsh. The isthmus was a narrow strip of land, only about 50 miles across at its narrowest point, but those 50 miles were some of the most challenging terrain imaginable. Dense jungle, oppressive heat and humidity, swamps, rivers to cross, and mountains to climb made the journey exhausting. There were few roads and no railroad yet across the isthmus. Travellers rode mules when they could, walked when they had to, and sometimes travelled by canoe up rivers. Disease was a constant threat. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, and cholera thrived in the tropical climate. Many gold seekers died in Panama, never reaching California. Those who survived the crossing often found themselves stranded on the Pacific side, as there were far more travellers than available ship berths. Some waited weeks or even months in the unhealthy climate of Panama City, watching their resources dwindle and their health deteriorate. Despite these dangers, the Panama route was popular, particularly with those coming from the eastern seaboard. Tens of thousands made the crossing, and those who survived and found passage to San Francisco reached California months ahead of those who had chosen the Cape Horn route. The third major route was the overland trail across the North American continent. This was the choice for many in the Midwest, and for those who lacked the resources for sea passage. The overland journey was approximately 2,000 miles from the jumping-off points on the Missouri River, such as Independence or St. Joseph, to the gold fields of California. The overland route followed paths already established by earlier migrants to Oregon and by fur trappers and traders. Travelers organized themselves into wagon companies, pooling resources for wagons, draft animals, and supplies. The journey required substantial preparation. Each person or family needed to acquire a wagon, oxen, or mules to pull it, and provisions for several months. Flour, bacon, coffee, sugar, beans, and other staples. Prices for these necessities skyrocketed in the jumping-off towns as demand surged. The overland journey had to be carefully timed. Travelers needed to depart in the spring after the prairie grass had grown enough to provide forage for the animals, but early enough to cross the Sierra Nevada before winter snows made the passes impassable. The tragedy of the Donner Party in 1846, when a group of California-bound emigrants became trapped by early snows in the Sierra and resorted to cannibalism to survive, was fresh in everyone's memory. The trail crossed varied and often challenging terrain. The first section, across the Great Plains, was relatively easy travelling, though monotonous. Water and grass were generally available, and the terrain was flat enough for wagons to make good progress. But as the trail moved west, challenges increased. The crossing of the Rocky Mountains required navigating steep passes. Water became scarce in the arid regions of what is now Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. The 40-mile desert west of the Humboldt Sink in Nevada was particularly dreaded, a waterless wasteland that had to be crossed as quickly as possible. The final challenge was the Sierra Nevada. The passes through these mountains were steep and rocky, requiring wagons to be dismantled and carried or lowered by rope down steep slopes. Some companies abandoned their wagons entirely at this point, packing their remaining possessions onto mules or their own backs for the final push into California. The overland journey was dangerous. Cholera was a major killer, breaking out in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of wagon camps and spreading rapidly. Some companies lost a third or more of their members to disease. Accidents were common. People were crushed by wagons, gored by livestock, drowned crossing rivers. Contrary to popular myth, Indian attacks were relatively rare, though theft of livestock and occasional skirmishes did occur. More common were deaths from exhaustion, exposure, and the cumulative effects of inadequate diet and contaminated water. Despite the hardships, approximately 43,000 people took the overland route to California in 1849. Their passage transformed the trail itself, leaving it littered with abandoned wagons, furniture, mining equipment, and the graves of those who didn't survive. Later travelers reported walking for miles past the debris of earlier companies. Not all gold seekers came from the United States. News of the discovery spread around the world, and people from dozens of nations made their way to California. Mexico, which had just lost California in the war, sent thousands of miners north, particularly from the state of Sonora. These miners brought sophisticated knowledge of gold mining techniques that many Americans lacked. They introduced the arrastra, a device for crushing ore, and had experience with hard rock mining. South American countries, particularly Chile and Peru, contributed thousands of gold seekers. These were often experienced miners, as mining was an established industry in South America. They typically came by ship, making the relatively short journey up the Pacific coast. From across the Pacific, Chinese miners began arriving in significant numbers by 1850. The majority came from Guangdong province in southern China, an area experiencing political instability and economic hardship. Many Chinese miners were part of a credit ticket system, where associations or wealthy sponsors paid for their passage in exchange for a portion of their earnings. They faced discrimination and violence in California, but persevered, establishing significant Chinese communities, particularly in San Francisco. Europe contributed tens of thousands of gold seekers. The French came in large numbers, often in organized companies. The German states sent prospectors, as did Ireland, which was still reeling from the Great Famine. English miners brought experience from Cornwall's tin mines. Australians came, making the long voyage across the Pacific. Even more distant countries like India and the Pacific Islands sent small numbers of fortune seekers. This massive migration of peoples from around the world gave California a uniquely cosmopolitan character. In the mining camps and in San Francisco, one might hear dozens of languages spoken, see people in the traditional dress of nations from every continent, and encounter a bewildering mixture of cultures and customs. It was a volatile mixture that would lead to both remarkable cultural exchange and violent conflict. The journey to California, regardless of the route chosen, was a transformative experience. Those who survived it arrived in California changed. They had left behind the structure and certainties of their former lives. Many would never return home. They had endured hardships that tested them physically and mentally, and now they faced the ultimate test. Could they actually find gold? Part 4. Life in the Gold Fields. When the 49ers finally arrived in California, exhausted from their journeys by land or sea, they confronted a reality that was both thrilling and daunting. The gold fields stretched along the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada, primarily in an area known as the Mother Lode, running roughly from the northern reaches near Downieville south to Mariposa. This region, approximately 150 miles long and 50 miles wide, became home to hundreds of mining camps with colourful and often darkly humorous names. There was Hangtown, later renamed Placerville, which earned its original name from the summary justice meted out to criminals. There was Rough and Ready, founded by miners from Wisconsin who had served under Captain A. Ruff during the Mexican War. There was You Bet, Poker Flat, Whiskey Diggings, Shirt Tail, Git Up and Git, Groundhog Glory, and countless others. These names reflected the rough and ready character of mining camp culture and the miners' dark sense of humour about their circumstances. The physical environment of the gold fields was harsh. Summer temperatures in the Sierra foothills regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Miners worked in full sun, standing in cold streams or bent over rockers and sluice boxes for 12 to 14 hours a day. Dust from dry diggings filled the air, coating everything and everyone. Winter brought rain that turned mining camps into seas of mud, and occasionally snow that shut down operations entirely. The earliest miners, those who arrived in 1848 and early 1849, often found gold in extraordinary quantities. These were the lucky ones who worked the richest surface deposits before they were exhausted. Stories circulated of miners collecting a pound of gold dust in a single day, worth approximately $240 at the time, when a labourer in the eastern states might earn $1 per day. Some claims produced thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars worth of gold in a matter of weeks. But for those who arrived later in 1849 and in subsequent years, the reality was often disappointing. The richest surface deposits were quickly claimed and worked out. New arrivals found themselves facing a fundamental problem. all the good claims were taken. Mining law in the early gold rush was largely informal, based on local customs rather than established legal principles. Generally, a miner could claim a piece of ground by marking its boundaries and working it regularly. The size of claims varied by location and local custom, typically ranging from 10 to 30 feet square. This system worked reasonably well when there was abundant unclaimed land, but as more miners arrived, competition for claims intensified. Disputes were common and sometimes violent. Mining camps developed their own systems of self-governance, holding miners' meetings to establish local rules, settle disputes, and occasionally mete out justice to thieves and claim jumpers. The techniques of gold mining evolved rapidly as miners learned what worked in California's particular conditions. The simplest method was panning, useful for prospecting and for working small quantities of gravel. The miner would fill a pan with gravel from a stream bed, add water, and use a swirling motion to wash away lighter material while the heavier gold particles settled to the bottom. Panning was slow and laborious, but required minimal equipment. More efficient was the rocker or cradle, a wooden box mounted on rockers, similar to a baby's cradle. Gravel and water were shoveled into the top, and the device was rocked back and forth, causing water to flow through and wash lighter materials away, while gold and heavy sand caught on wooden riffles in the bottom. A good rocker allowed a team of 2 or 3 miners to process much more gravel than they could by panning. The long tom was a larger, more stationary version of the rocker, a long wooden trough with riffles and a perforated iron sheet at one end to screen out larger rocks. It required more water and was typically used where a steady stream could be diverted to provide flow through the trough. The ultimate development in placer mining was the sluice box, essentially a very long tom, sometimes hundreds of feet long, through which large volumes of water and gravel could be processed. Sluice boxes required significant investment in lumber and labour to construct and needed abundant water, but they could process vast amounts of material. As individual claims became less productive, miners increasingly formed companies to pool resources for such larger operations. Water was crucial for all these methods. Miners in the early years relied on the natural flow of streams and rivers, which meant that mining operations were limited during the dry summer months when streams ran low. This problem led to one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the gold rush era, the construction of extensive systems of ditches, flumes and dams to bring water from higher elevations to the diggings. These water companies built hundreds of miles of wooden flumes, some perched on tall trestles across canyons, others carved into hillsides. They constructed dams to create reservoirs and dug ditches to carry water across the landscape. Miners purchased water from these companies, paying fees based on the volume used. The investment required to build these systems was substantial, running into hundreds of thousands of dollars, and marked a transition from individual mining efforts to larger capitalized enterprises. As surface placer deposits were exhausted, miners turned to hydraulic mining, a technique that used high-pressure jets of water to blast away entire hillsides, washing the gold-bearing gravel into sluices for processing. This method was incredibly destructive to the landscape, but highly effective at recovering gold from deposits that would have been impractical to mine by other methods. The development of the monitor A large nozzle that could direct a powerful stream of water made hydraulic mining even more effective and more destructive. Not all California gold was found in placer deposits. There were also lode or hard rock deposits where gold remained locked in quartz veins within solid rock. Mining these deposits required very different techniques. Miners had to tunnel into mountains following quartz veins, extract the ore, transport it to the surface, crush it to free the gold, and then process the crushed ore to separate gold from rock. Hard rock mining required significant capital investment in tunnels, timber for shoring up tunnels, ore carts, hoisting equipment, and crushing mills. It was dangerous work. Tunnel collapses were common, as were accidents involving falling rocks, premature explosions of blasting powder, and cave-ins. As the gold rush progressed, hard rock mining increasingly dominated, as it was the only way to access the remaining gold deposits. The shift from placer to hard rock mining represented a fundamental change in the nature of the gold rush. The early years had been dominated by individual miners or small partnerships working placer claims with simple tools. This was the democratic phase of the gold rush, when anyone with a pan and strong back had a chance at striking it rich. But hard rock mining required capital and organization. It meant working for wages in a mine owned by a company rather than working one's own claim. It meant the transformation of independent prospectors into wage labourers. Daily life in the mining camps was harsh and monotonous. Most miners lived in crude shelters, canvas tents, brush lean-tos, or simple cabins thrown together from rough lumber. Furnishings were minimal, perhaps a bedroll, a few cooking implements and tools. Privacy was non-existent in the crowded camps. The diet was unhealthy and repetitive, heavily dependent on pork, beans, and bread. Fresh vegetables and fruit were rare and expensive. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was common. Miners rose at dawn and worked until dark, 6 or 7 days a week. The work was physically demanding, digging, shoveling, carrying heavy loads, standing in cold water. Injuries were common and often poorly treated. Medical care was primitive and expensive. Many miners suffered from chronic ailments, rheumatism from standing in cold water, lung diseases from breathing rock dust, hernias from heavy lifting. Entertainment in the camps was limited, but important for maintaining morale. On Sundays and in the evenings, miners gambled, drank, told stories, and wrote letters home. Gambling was ubiquitous, with card games and games of chance running constantly in saloons and boarding houses. Some miners lost in a single night of gambling what they had spent weeks or months accumulating. Mail from home was desperately important to the miners, a connection to the world they had left behind. The arrival of mail in a camp was a major event, with miners gathering to hear news from home. Letter writing was a common evening activity, with men labouring over letters by candlelight, trying to explain their experiences and maintain connections with family members thousands of miles away. The gender imbalance in the mining camps was extreme. In 1850, the population of California was over 90% male. Women were so rare that their presence in a camp was a noteworthy event. This imbalance had profound effects on camp society. It contributed to the rough, unrefined character of camp life. It created a market for prostitution, with women in the sex trade commanding high prices for their services. It also meant that the few respectable women in the camps were treated with exaggerated courtesy and respect. Some women came to California with their husbands and families. Others came independently, seeing opportunities in the gold fields beyond mining. Women ran boarding houses, laundries, bakeries, and restaurants. These were often extremely profitable enterprises, as miners would pay premium prices for home-cooked meals and clean clothes. A woman running a boarding house or pie shop could sometimes earn more than a miner working a good claim. The ethnic diversity of the gold fields created both richness and tension. In the early days of the rush, there was a degree of cooperation across ethnic lines. Miners from different nations worked adjacent claims, traded techniques and information, and sometimes formed partnerships. But as competition for claims intensified and as racial prejudices took hold, this cooperation often gave way to hostility and violence. Mexican and South American miners, particularly those from Sonora, faced increasing discrimination. In 1850, the California legislature passed the Foreign Miners Tax, which required foreign miners to pay a $20 monthly fee for the privilege of mining. The tax was primarily aimed at Hispanic miners and was enforced selectively, with American miners often exempt even when they were technically foreigners. The tax drove many Hispanic miners out of California and led to violent confrontations in some areas. Chinese miners faced perhaps the worst discrimination. They were often restricted to claims that had been abandoned by white miners as worked out, forced to rework old diggings in the hope of finding gold that earlier miners had missed. They were subjected to special taxes, violence, and legal discrimination that denied them the right to testify in court against white persons. Despite these obstacles, Chinese miners persisted, often working cooperatively in groups and sending a portion of their earnings back to China to support families. African Americans in the gold fields included both free blacks who had come to California seeking opportunity and escaped or freed slaves brought west by their former masters. They faced discrimination and were excluded from claiming land or voting, but some still managed to accumulate wealth through mining or other enterprises. The question of slavery in California was contentious and would be addressed in the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state. Native Americans faced perhaps the most tragic fate in the gold rush. The massive influx of miners devastated indigenous communities. Miners occupied traditional hunting and gathering grounds, polluted streams with mining runoff, and cut down forests that indigenous peoples depended on. Violence against Native Americans was common and often went unpunished. The indigenous population of California, which may have been as high as 300,000 before the gold rush, would decline to approximately 30,000 by the end of the 19th century, a catastrophic demographic collapse caused by disease, violence, and starvation. The mining camps developed their own rough systems of justice and governance. In the absence of established government authority, miners' meetings served as legislature, court, and executive all in one. These meetings could establish local mining regulations, settle disputes over claims, and try accused criminals. Justice was often swift and harsh. For serious crimes, particularly theft and murder, punishment might be death by hanging. Less serious offences might result in whipping, banishment from the camp, or cropping of ears. This vigilante justice was brutal and sometimes wrong. Innocent people were hanged based on circumstantial evidence or because they were the wrong ethnicity. But the miners generally saw these systems as necessary in the absence of formal law enforcement. It would take several years before California developed a more stable legal system and formal government institutions capable of maintaining order. Part 5. San Francisco and the Urban Gold Rush. While the mining camps represented one face of the gold rush, California's cities, particularly San Francisco, represented another. The transformation of San Francisco from a sleepy settlement to a booming metropolis was as dramatic as anything happening in the goldfields, and in its own way just as significant. In January 1848, when James Marshall discovered gold, the settlement on San Francisco Bay was called Yerba Buena and had a population of perhaps 800 people. It was a collection of adobe buildings and wooden shacks clustered around a cove, with a few wharves extending into the bay. The surrounding area was a landscape of sand dunes and hills. By the end of 1849, San Francisco had a population of approximately 25,000, and that number would continue to grow rapidly. By 1852, the population exceeded 36,000. This explosive growth created opportunities and challenges unlike anything seen before in American urban development. San Francisco became the primary port of entry for gold seekers arriving by sea and the main supply center for the mines. Ships arrived daily from ports around the world, carrying passengers and cargo. The harbor became choked with vessels, hundreds at a time, many of them abandoned by crews who had deserted to head for the gold fields. Some of these abandoned ships were deliberately run aground and converted into warehouses, stores, hotels, and saloons, their hulls providing ready-made structures in a city desperate for building space. The physical growth of the city was chaotic and rapid. Streets were laid out in a grid, but building happened faster than planning. Structures of every description sprang up. Wooden buildings thrown up in days, canvas tents serving as shops and hotels, multi-story brick buildings constructed by those with capital to invest. Property values skyrocketed. Land that had sold for a few dollars before the gold rush now commanded thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. Real estate speculation became as important as gold mining as a path to wealth. Men made fortunes buying property one week and selling it the next at vastly inflated prices. Others lost everything when property values occasionally crashed during periodic economic downturns. The most successful real estate speculators of the gold rush era became some of San Francisco's wealthiest and most influential citizens. Fire was a constant threat in Gold Rush San Francisco. The city suffered major fires in December 1849, May 1850, June 1850, September 1850, May 1851, and June 1851. Each fire destroyed large portions of the city, and each time San Francisco rebuilt, usually bigger and better than before. The frequent fires were both disaster and opportunity, clearing away inferior structures and allowing for rebuilding with better materials and planning. The May 1851 fire was particularly devastating, destroying much of the city centre and causing millions of dollars in damage. It started in a paint and upholstery store and spread rapidly through the densely packed wooden buildings. Witnesses described the fire as creating its own wind, with flames leaping from building to building faster than people could flee. Despite the destruction, within weeks, reconstruction was underway, with property owners racing to rebuild before they lost their lucrative commercial tenants. San Francisco's economy in the gold rush era was built on serving the miners. Everything a miner needed, from pickaxes to pork to playing cards, had to be transported to California and distributed to the mines. This created opportunities for merchants, shippers, warehousing companies, and distributors. The markup on goods was enormous. Items that cost a few cents in the eastern states might sell for dollars in San Francisco, and even more in the remote mining camps. Some of the most successful gold rush entrepreneurs never went near the mines. Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco in 1853 with a supply of canvas for making tents and wagon covers. Finding that miners needed durable work pants, he began manufacturing heavy-duty trousers, eventually switching from canvas to a durable cotton fabric called denim. His heavy riveted denim pants became known as Levi's, and the company he founded would become a global brand. Domingo Ghirardelli came to California from Italy and established a confectionery business in San Francisco. Henry Wells and William Fargo established an express service and banking business that bore their names. Leland Stanford opened a store selling mining equipment before entering politics and later founding the university that bears his name. These men and others like them demonstrated that there were many paths to wealth in Gold Rush California, and not all of them led through the mines. Banking and finance became major industries in San Francisco. Miners needed secure places to store their gold dust, and they needed services to send money home or to have funds transferred to California. Early in the gold rush, commerce often operated on a barter system, with gold dust serving as currency. Merchants kept scales to weigh out dust in payment for goods. But this system was cumbersome and subject to fraud, as gold dust could be diluted with brass filings or black sand. Banking houses sprang up to provide financial services. Some were branches of established Eastern or European banks. Others were new institutions created specifically for the California market. These banks accepted gold dust and nuggets for deposit, issued banknotes and letters of credit, and provided loans. Some also engaged in gold dust purchasing, buying dust from miners and selling it in bulk to shippers who would transport it east or to the United States Mint. The express companies, particularly Wells Fargo and Adams & Company, played a crucial role in California's economy. They transported gold from the mines to San Francisco, delivered mail and packages to even the most remote mining camps, and provided banking services. Their stagecoaches and armed guards became iconic images of the gold rush era. San Francisco's population was as diverse as that of the mining camps, but the diversity took different forms. While the mines were overwhelmingly male, San Francisco had a somewhat more balanced, though still heavily male, population. Women came to the city as wives and daughters of merchants, as independent businesswomen running boarding houses and shops, and as prostitutes serving the city's large male population. The city developed distinct ethnic neighborhoods. The Chinese established a community that would grow into the largest Chinatown in North America. The neighborhood centered on Sacramento Street and included shops, restaurants, temples, gambling houses, and the offices of the Chinese merchant organizations known as the Six Companies, which provided crucial support to Chinese immigrants. Hispanic communities, particularly of Chileans and Peruvians, developed around Telegraph Hill. French immigrants clustered in certain areas, establishing restaurants and importing the food and wine of their homeland. The city had Irish neighborhoods, German neighborhoods, and enclaves of immigrants from nearly every corner of the world. This diversity gave San Francisco a cosmopolitan character unusual for an American city of its size. The city's entertainment and vice industries flourished. Theaters and concert halls opened, bringing performers from around the world. Lola Montez, the famous dancer and courtesan, performed in San Francisco, as did numerous other entertainers who saw opportunity in the free-spending gold rush economy. Opera, Shakespeare, variety shows, and popular entertainment of every sort found eager audiences. Gambling houses operated openly, some of them lavishly appointed with chandeliers, oil paintings, and expensive furnishings. The largest gambling establishments were major businesses, employing dozens of dealers and supporting staff. Games ran 24 hours a day, and fortunes changed hands nightly. The gambling houses also served as informal meeting places and centers of city life. Prostitution was widespread and relatively open. The city's extreme gender imbalance created a large market for sexual services. Women in prostitution ranged from elegant courtesans who entertained wealthy merchants in luxurious parlor houses to desperate women working in cribs in the Barbary Coast district under brutal conditions. The more successful madams, like Ah Toy, a Chinese woman who ran a brothel catering to Chinese miners, could become wealthy and influential figures. The consumption of alcohol was prodigious. San Francisco had hundreds of saloons, from crude drinking establishments to elegant hotel bars. Drinking was social lubricant and entertainment in a city where many residents were lonely and far from home. Alcoholism was a serious problem, contributing to violence, poverty, and early death for many Gold Rush participants. Crime was a major concern in Gold Rush San Francisco. The rapid growth, transient population, lack of established law enforcement, and abundance of wealth created perfect conditions for criminal activity. Theft, assault, and murder were common. Organized criminal gangs operated openly in some parts of the city, particularly in the area known as the Barbary Coast, a rough waterfront district notorious for violence and vice. The response to this crime problem was the formation of vigilance committees, extra-legal organizations of citizens who took law enforcement into their own hands. The first major vigilance committee formed in 1851 after a series of fires suspected to be arson and a crime wave that the existing authorities seemed unable to control. The Vigilance Committee of 1851 claimed about 700 members and took aggressive action against suspected criminals. They arrested suspects, held trials, and executed 4 men by hanging. They also banished dozens of others from the city under threat of death if they returned. The committee's actions were controversial, praised by some as necessary to establish order and condemned by others as vigilante justice that undermined legitimate authority. A second, even larger vigilance committee, formed in 1856 in response to political corruption and continuing crime problems. This committee claimed over 8,000 members and effectively took control of the city for several months, establishing a military-style organization complete with uniforms and drill exercises. They hanged 4 men and exiled many others. The 1856 Vigilance Committee had lasting political impact, with its members going on to dominate San Francisco politics for years. The Vigilance Committees represented a tension in Gold Rush, California, between the formal institutions of government and law, which were often weak or corrupt, and popular movements that claimed to represent the will of the people. This tension would continue throughout the gold rush period and beyond, shaping California's political culture. San Francisco also became a center for journalism in the gold rush era. Newspapers proliferated, serving both as sources of information and as platforms for political debate and cultural commentary. The Alta California, the California Star, the Daily Evening Bulletin, and numerous other papers competed for readers. These papers brought news from the mines, reported on arrivals and departures of ships, published letters from miners, and editorialized on every aspect of California life. Some gold rush journalists went on to national or international fame. Mark Twain, though he arrived slightly after the main gold rush years, got his start as a reporter in California and Nevada. Bret Hart wrote stories of mining camp life that reached a national audience and helped create the mythology of the gold rush. These writers and others transformed the raw experience of the gold rush into narratives that shaped how Americans understood the event. The cultural life of San Francisco developed rapidly. Libraries were established, including the Mercantile Library, which became a center of intellectual life. Churches of every denomination built houses of worship, serving both religious and social functions for their congregations. Fraternal organizations, particularly the Masons and Oddfellows, established lodges that provided social networks and mutual aid for their members. Education was initially neglected in the gold rush chaos, but by the early 1850s, schools were being established. The public school system developed slowly, but private schools and academies opened to serve the children of the city's growing middle and upper classes. Higher education would come later, with the eventual establishment of the University of California and other institutions. San Francisco's infrastructure struggled to keep up with its population growth. Water supply was a constant problem. Early residents relied on wells and on water sold by vendors who hauled it from springs and streams outside the city. A proper water system with pipes and reservoirs would not be completed until years after the gold rush. Sewage and waste disposal were primitive, contributing to periodic outbreaks of cholera and other diseases. Streets were often in terrible condition, particularly in winter when rain turned them into rivers of mud. The city eventually began a massive project of grading streets and filling in low-lying areas, using sand from the dunes and debris from demolished buildings. Some streets were planked with wood to make them passable, though these wooden streets were fire hazards and required constant maintenance. Despite these challenges, San Francisco established itself as the dominant city on the Pacific coast. It became the financial center for the entire region, the primary port for trade with Asia and the Pacific, and the cultural capital of the West. The wealth generated by the gold rush created a class of citizens with the resources and inclination to transform San Francisco from a rough mining town into a genuine city with aspirations to rival the great cities of the East Coast and Europe. Part 6. The business of gold, mining companies, and industrialization. By 1851 and 1852, the nature of gold mining in California was changing fundamentally. The era of the individual miner with a pan and a dream was giving way to a new era of industrial mining requiring capital, organization, and technology. This transformation had profound implications for who could participate in mining and who would benefit from California's gold. The easiest and richest placer deposits had been largely exhausted by 1851. Miners who arrived hoping to find fortunes lying on the ground were disappointed. The gold that remained required more effort, more sophisticated techniques, and more capital investment to extract. This reality led to the formation of mining companies and the introduction of increasingly elaborate mining methods. Hydraulic mining, which we touched on earlier, represented one response to the challenge of extracting gold from less rich deposits. The technique used powerful streams of water delivered through large nozzles called monitors to blast away entire hillsides. The water pressure was generated by bringing water from high elevation sources through pipes or ditches, building up tremendous pressure by the time it reached the mining site. The monitors could direct streams of water with enough force to kill a person at close range. Miners used these water cannons to carve away at hillsides, washing millions of tons of gravel and dirt into elaborate systems of sluices where the gold could be recovered. A single hydraulic mining operation might employ dozens of men and process more material in a day than a solitary miner could process in a lifetime. The environmental impact of hydraulic mining was catastrophic. Entire mountains were washed away. The debris, called slickens, clogged rivers and streams, causing flooding in the Central Valley and destroying agricultural land. The sediment reached San Francisco Bay, altering its depth and ecology. The mercury used in the gold recovery process poisoned waterways, creating environmental damage that persists to this day. Hydraulic mining required massive capital investment. Companies had to purchase land and water rights, construct elaborate systems of ditches and flumes to bring water to the mining site, buy or manufacture the monitors and other equipment, and employ the labor force needed to operate the mines. This was far beyond the means of individual miners, so mining companies were formed, selling shares to investors to raise the needed capital. These mining companies represented a new phase of California capitalism. They issued stock, held shareholder meetings, employed managers and engineers, and operated according to business principles rather than the informal practices of the early gold rush. Some became quite large, employing hundreds of workers and operating multiple mine sites. The successful companies paid dividends to their shareholders, creating a class of investors who profited from mining without ever wielding a pick or standing in a stream. Not all mining companies were successful. Many were speculative ventures that promised more than they could deliver. Some were outright frauds, selling stock in non-existent mines or in played-out claims represented as rich deposits. The San Francisco stock market became a center for trading mining shares, and it was subject to wild fluctuations as rumors of rich strikes or disappointing results circulated. Fortunes were made and lost in mining stock speculation, just as they were in actual mining. Hard rock or quartz mining, which involved tunneling into mountains to follow veins of gold-bearing quartz, also required significant capital and organization. Unlike placer mining, which could be done with relatively simple tools, hard rock mining required drilling equipment, blasting powder, timber for shoring up tunnels, hoisting equipment to bring ore to the surface, and crushing mills to process the ore. The process of hard rock mining was complex and dangerous. Miners would identify a quartz outcropping or vein on the surface and begin digging or blasting a tunnel to follow it into the mountain. Work was done by hand drilling, with one miner holding a steel drill while another struck it with a hammer, slowly boring holes into the rock. These holes were then filled with black powder and blasted, breaking the rock so it could be removed. Tunnel collapses were an ever-present danger. Miners worked underground by the light of candles or lamps in conditions of heat, dust, and poor air quality. Accidental explosions of blasting powder killed and injured many. As tunnels went deeper, flooding became a problem, requiring pumps to remove water. Ventilation was poor, and many miners suffered from lung diseases caused by inhaling rock dust. The ore brought to the surface had to be crushed to free the gold from the quartz. Early stamp mills used heavy iron stamps that were lifted and dropped repeatedly, pulverizing the ore. These mills were noisy, dangerous, and required power, initially provided by water wheels and later by steam engines. The crushed ore was then processed using mercury, which amalgamated with the gold, allowing it to be separated from the rock. The mercury was later heated to drive it off as vapor, leaving the gold behind. This process exposed workers to mercury with devastating health consequences. As hard rock mining developed, it became increasingly dominated by large companies with the capital to invest in deep shafts, complex tunnel systems, and expensive processing equipment. The Comstock lode, discovered in Nevada in 1859, represented the ultimate development of this industrial approach to mining, with shafts reaching thousands of feet deep and requiring millions of dollars in investment. The transformation of mining into an industrial enterprise changed the social structure of the mining regions. The independent miner gave way to the wage laborer working for a company. Mining became a job rather than an entrepreneurial venture. The wages were decent by the standards of the time, typically $3 to $4 per day for underground miners, but the work was hard, dangerous, and offered little prospect of striking it rich. Labour relations in the industrial mines were often contentious. Miners organised unions to demand better wages, safer working conditions, and shorter hours. Mining companies resisted these demands, sometimes importing strike breakers or calling on state authorities to suppress labour unrest. The conflicts between miners and mining companies in California and Nevada in the 1850s and 60s foreshadowed the larger labour struggles that would characterize American industry in the late 19th century. The industrialization of mining also led to specialization and the development of mining engineering as a profession. Mining engineers, many trained at technical schools in Germany, England, or the eastern United States, were employed to design mine workings, solve technical problems, and manage operations. These engineers introduced more systematic and scientific approaches to mining, improving efficiency and safety, though the work remained dangerous by modern standards. The supporting industries that grew up around mining were also significant. Machine shops manufactured and repaired mining equipment. Foundries cast iron parts for stamp mills and other machinery. Lumber companies harvested timber for shoring up tunnels and building flumes and sluice boxes. The demand for iron led to attempts to establish iron foundries in California, though most iron was imported from the East or from England. Chemical companies supplied mercury, blasting powder, and other necessary materials. Transportation infrastructure developed to serve the needs of mining. Roads were improved, sometimes at company expense, to allow heavy equipment to be hauled to mine sites. Flumes were built not just for water transport, but also to carry lumber from sawmills in the high Sierra to the mines. In the 1860s, railroads would begin to reach into the mining regions, further transforming the economics of mining by reducing transportation costs. The boom and bust cycle that characterized placer mining also affected industrial mining, but on a larger scale with more serious consequences. When a rich vein was discovered, a rush of investment would follow, with mining companies forming and stock prices soaring. Mines would be sunk, mills built, and workers hired. If the vein proved as rich as hoped, profits could be enormous. But if the vein pinched out or proved less rich than expected, the mines would close, the equipment would be abandoned, and workers would be left unemployed. Entire towns rose and fell with the fortunes of nearby mines. A rich strike would create a booming town of thousands almost overnight, complete with stores, saloons, churches, and schools. When the ore ran out, the town might empty just as quickly, becoming a ghost town. The California landscape is dotted with the remains of these once thriving communities, now nothing but ruins and memories. The legal framework for mining also evolved during this period. California developed a mining code based on local customs and practices, establishing rules for claim size, maintenance requirements, and dispute resolution. This code was later adopted with variations by other Western mining regions and influenced federal mining law. The law generally favored private enterprise and provided miners and mining companies with generous rights to extract resources from public lands. Water rights were a particularly complex and contentious legal issue. The common law doctrine of riparian rights, which gave property owners rights to water flowing through their land, was poorly suited to California's conditions where water was scarce and had to be transported long distances. California developed the doctrine of prior appropriation, which essentially granted water rights to those who first put water to beneficial use, regardless of where their land was located. This doctrine, summed up in the phrase "first in time, first in right," allowed mining companies to claim water from distant sources and transport it to their mines. The development of water law and mining law in California had lasting impacts far beyond the gold rush. These legal principles spread to other Western states and shaped the development of the entire region. They established a framework that privileged economic development and resource extraction, with environmental and social costs that would only become fully apparent much later. Part 7. Society and Culture in Gold Rush, California. The gold rush created a unique society in California, one characterized by rapid change, cultural diversity, democratic ideals mixed with violent prejudice, and a peculiar combination of lawlessness and community organization. Understanding this society requires looking beyond the mechanics of mining to the human experiences of those who participated in the gold rush. The correspondence and diaries of gold rush participants provide windows into their experiences, hopes, and disappointments. These documents reveal people struggling to make sense of a radically new environment, coping with loneliness and homesickness, dealing with moral temptations, and trying to decide whether to stay in California or return home. Letter writing was a crucial link to the world left behind. Miners would spend hours composing letters by candlelight, trying to describe their experiences to family members who could scarcely imagine what California was like. Letters home often concealed difficulties and exaggerated successes, either from pride or from a desire not to worry loved ones. Many miners were embarrassed to admit failure after the grand send-offs they had received when departing for California. The arrival of mail from home was a major event. Miners would gather at the express office when mail was delivered, eagerly waiting to hear their names called. A letter from home could lift a miner's spirits for days. The lack of a letter could be devastating, leading to anxiety about the welfare of family members or despair that one had been forgotten. Religious life in the gold rush was complex. Many observers noted that California seemed to bring out both the best and worst in people. The rough conditions and absence of traditional social controls led some to abandon previous moral standards. Drinking, gambling, and visiting prostitutes became routine for many miners. Sabbath observance was rare in the camps, with Sunday treated as just another work day or as a day for recreation and vice. Yet religion did not disappear from the gold fields. Ministers and priests followed the gold seekers to California, establishing churches and holding services even in the roughest camps. Itinerant preachers traveled from camp to camp, preaching in saloons, tents, or open air to congregations of miners. These religious services provided moral guidance and a connection to traditional values for those who attended. Some miners experienced profound religious conversions in California, sometimes prompted by close calls with death, disease, or other crises. Others became deeply cynical about religion, seeing the gap between Christian professions and actual behavior in California as evidence of hypocrisy. Still, others simply became indifferent, too absorbed in the pursuit of gold or too exhausted by labor to give much thought to spiritual matters. The ethnic and racial diversity of Gold Rush California created both opportunities for cultural exchange and sources of conflict. In the mining camps, one might encounter Chinese miners preparing rice and tea, Mexican miners singing corridos, Chilean miners making empanadas, French miners debating politics, and American miners from various states arguing about sectional issues. Food and foodways reflected this diversity. Chinese miners introduced American miners to rice and stir-fried vegetables. Mexican miners shared their knowledge of chili peppers and corn tortillas. European miners brought sausages, cheeses, and various styles of bread. Over time, a kind of hybrid cuisine developed in California, borrowing from various traditions. The restaurants and boarding houses of San Francisco offered remarkable culinary diversity for an American city of the period. Language was a constant challenge in the cosmopolitan goldfields. Few miners spoke multiple languages, leading to communication difficulties and misunderstandings. Some words and phrases from Spanish, Chinese, and Native American languages entered the local English dialect. A pidgin language developed in some areas, allowing basic communication across linguistic barriers. Translators and interpreters found steady employment, particularly in San Francisco, where they facilitated business transactions. Music and entertainment reflected cultural diversity as well. Miners from different backgrounds brought their musical traditions. There were American folk songs and popular tunes from the East, Mexican ballads, Chinese opera, German drinking songs, Irish reels, and French cafe music. Saloons and theaters in San Francisco and larger mining towns offered entertainment ranging from classical music to bawdy variety shows. The theater was particularly popular in Gold Rush, California. Audiences were enthusiastic and sometimes rowdy, cheering favorite performers and showering the stage with coins and gold nuggets for particularly appreciated performances. Shakespearean actors toured the mining camps, performing classics to audiences of miners. The juxtaposition of muddy mining towns and performances of Hamlet or Macbeth struck many observers as remarkable. Literacy and education levels among Gold Rush participants varied widely. Many miners were well educated, with some having college degrees or professional training. Others were barely literate or completely illiterate. This variation reflected the diverse backgrounds of gold seekers, but also created demand for education services. Newspapers were eagerly read and passed from hand to hand. Books were valued possessions, with miners carrying volumes of poetry, novels, or technical works in their limited baggage. The establishment of schools in California was initially haphazard. Families with children agitated for schools in their communities, sometimes hiring teachers privately when public education was unavailable. The quality of education varied tremendously. Some teachers were dedicated professionals. Others were failed miners taking up teaching as a fallback occupation. The one-room schoolhouse became a symbol of community formation in California, a sign that a settlement was transitioning from temporary camp to permanent town. Health and medicine in Gold Rush, California were primitive and often ineffective by modern standards. Disease was a constant threat. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases spread rapidly in crowded camps with poor sanitation. Scurvy afflicted miners whose diets lacked fresh fruits and vegetables. Rheumatism and arthritis plagued those who spent long hours standing in cold water. Accidents and injuries were common, and the medical treatment available was often inadequate. Doctors in the gold fields ranged from trained physicians to complete charlatans. The legitimate doctors struggled with limited supplies, primitive conditions, and diseases they didn't fully understand. Medical knowledge in the 1850s was still quite limited. Germ theory was not yet accepted, and treatments often did more harm than good. Bleeding, purging, and dosing with mercury compounds were common treatments that probably killed as many as they cured. Many miners relied on self-treatment or on folk remedies. Patent medicines, many of them containing alcohol or opium, were widely used despite their dubious effectiveness. Some miners turned to alternative practitioners, Chinese herbal doctors, Native American healers, or practitioners of various other traditions. In the absence of effective scientific medicine, these alternatives were no worse and sometimes better than conventional treatment. Mental health was a serious but rarely discussed issue. The stress of the mining life, the disappointment of failure, the loneliness and isolation, and the prevalence of alcohol and gambling led to depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. Suicide rates in Gold Rush, California were high, particularly among miners who had lost everything and saw no way forward. Contemporary observers noted frequent cases of men who seemed to lose their minds, becoming paranoid, delusional, or simply giving up on life. Violence was common in Gold Rush society. Disputes over mining claims, gambling debts, romantic rivals, and simple drunken arguments frequently escalated to violence. Fistfights were everyday occurrences in the camps. Knife and gunfights were less common but not rare. Murders occurred with disturbing frequency, and many went unpunished, particularly when the victims were members of minority groups. The criminal justice system in California evolved gradually from the informal miners' courts to a more structured system of sheriffs, courts, and jails. But throughout the Gold Rush period, law enforcement remained inconsistent and sometimes corrupt. Sheriffs and judges were elected officials who often owed their positions to political machines or to the support of powerful mining interests. Justice was not always blind, with verdicts sometimes depending on the ethnicity or social status of those involved. Punishment for crimes was often harsh. Whipping was used for minor offences. For more serious crimes, punishment might include branding, ear cropping, or execution. Hangings were public events that drew large crowds. Some executions were carried out by legal authorities, others were acts of vigilante justice by miners' courts or vigilance committees. The distinction between legal and extra-legal punishment was sometimes unclear. The position of women in Gold Rush society was complex and contradictory. Women were a small minority, especially in the early years, but their presence had outsized impact. Respectable women, those who came as wives and daughters of miners and merchants, were placed on pedestals, treated with exaggerated courtesy and respect. Their mere presence in a camp was seen as a civilizing influence, encouraging men to moderate their behavior and language. Women ran businesses in Gold Rush, California, often with great success. Boarding houses, laundries, bakeries, and restaurants run by women could be highly profitable. The scarcity of women meant that services traditionally provided by women commanded premium prices. A woman who could cook well, sew, or do laundry could earn more than many miners. Some women became wealthy and influential through their business acumen, but women also faced significant constraints and dangers. They had limited legal rights under the laws of the time. Married women had little control over property or earnings, though California would eventually adopt more progressive property laws. Women traveling alone or working in certain occupations faced social stigma and sometimes violence. The extreme gender imbalance meant that women attracted unwanted attention and had to navigate a society that was in many ways designed by and for men. Women in prostitution occupied a particularly difficult position. They were stigmatized and legally vulnerable, subject to arrest and fines under various ordinances, yet their services were in demand and relatively well compensated. Conditions varied tremendously. Elite courtesans in San Francisco lived in luxury, entertaining wealthy clients and sometimes accumulating significant wealth. At the other extreme, women working in cribs in the roughest districts lived in desperate poverty and faced constant danger from violent clients and predatory pimps. Chinese women in California faced particular exploitation. Many had been deceived or coerced into coming to California, promised legitimate work only to be forced into prostitution. They were virtually enslaved, controlled by criminal organizations known as tongs, and had little hope of escape. Their plight attracted the attention of missionaries and reformers, but efforts to help them were largely ineffective against the powerful interests that profited from their exploitation. Family life in Gold Rush, California was challenging. Many miners had left families behind in the East or in foreign countries, intending to make their fortunes quickly and return home. But the reality was that success often eluded them, and the return home kept being postponed. Years might pass with family members separated by thousands of miles, connected only by irregular letters that took months to arrive. Some families eventually reunited in California, with wives and children making the difficult journey to join their husbands and fathers. The arrival of families changed the character of mining communities, creating pressure for schools, churches, and more stable social institutions. Communities with significant numbers of families tended to develop more quickly into permanent towns. Children in the mining camps often had unusual freedoms compared to their counterparts in the East. The loose social structure and the focus of adults on mining meant that children were sometimes left to their own devices. They played in the diggings, panned for gold, and learned lessons about life in the camps that would have shocked their more sheltered Eastern peers. Some observers worried about the moral education of children growing up in such environments. Yet, childhood in the goldfields had its harsh realities as well. Child labour was common, with children helping in family businesses or working for wages. Education was often interrupted or unavailable. Disease did not spare children, and many died from illnesses that would have been survivable with better medical care and nutrition. Orphans, created by disease, accidents, or abandonment, were not uncommon, and their care was an ongoing challenge for communities. Part 8. The Later Years and Transformation. By 1853 and 1854, California was changing rapidly. The easy gold was gone. The population was still growing, but at a slower rate. The state was developing more stable institutions and transitioning from a raw frontier to a more settled society. These later years of the gold rush saw continued mining, but also the development of agriculture, industry, and other economic activities. The mining techniques continued to evolve. Drift mining involved following gold-bearing gravel deposits underground by digging horizontal tunnels. River mining, or damming rivers to expose their gold-bearing gravels, became common despite the enormous labour involved. Some companies attempted to divert entire rivers by building elaborate systems of dams and channels, allowing them to mine the riverbed itself. The development of California agriculture was an important transition. The climate and soil of California proved excellent for growing a wide variety of crops. The Central Valley, with its rich soil and long growing season, was particularly productive. Farmers began growing wheat on a large scale, turning California into a major wheat exporter. Orchards and vineyards were planted, establishing the basis for California's fruit and wine industries that continue today. The transformation from mining economy to agricultural economy was significant for Native Americans. As miners moved on from exhausted diggings, farmers moved in, claiming land for cultivation. This agricultural expansion further displaced Native American communities, destroying their remaining hunting and gathering grounds. The pressure on Native American lands would continue throughout the 1850s and beyond, contributing to the catastrophic population decline. Chinese immigrants, facing increasing discrimination in mining, often turned to other occupations. They worked on farms, particularly during harvest season. They established laundries in cities and towns, filling a need in a society short of women who had traditionally done washing. They worked on infrastructure projects, including the massive project of draining and reclaiming marshlands in the Central Valley for agriculture. In the 1860s, Chinese labourers would be crucial to the construction of the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The question of California statehood had been resolved in 1850 as part of the Compromise of 1850, a complex series of measures intended to address growing tensions between free and slave states. California was admitted as a free state, meaning slavery was prohibited. This admission was significant, both for California and for the nation, as it upset the balance between free and slave states in the Senate and contributed to the growing crisis that would eventually lead to the Civil War. California's Constitutional Convention in 1849 had produced a remarkable document establishing a government with democratic institutions and providing for public education, women's property rights, and other progressive measures. The implementation of these constitutional provisions proceeded gradually through the 1850s. The state government, headquartered first in San Jose, then Vallejo, and finally Sacramento, struggled to establish authority over California's vast territory and sometimes unruly population. Taxation and government finance were contentious issues. Mining interests resisted taxation, arguing that the uncertainties of mining made tax burdens unfair. Other businesses and property owners complained about unequal tax burdens. The state's finances were often chaotic, with expenditures exceeding revenues and various schemes proposed to address budget shortfalls. Political life in Gold Rush, California was vigorous and sometimes violent. The Democratic and Whig parties, and later the Democrats and the new Republican Party, competed for power. Elections were rowdy affairs with widespread voter fraud, intimidation, and occasional violence. Political debates focused on issues such as land policy, taxation, law and order, and the treatment of different ethnic and racial groups. The question of land ownership was particularly complex and contentious. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had promised to respect the land grants made by the Spanish and Mexican governments, but the implementation of this promise proved difficult. Many California families held grants that had never been properly surveyed or documented according to American legal standards. The establishment of a land commission to adjudicate these claims led to years of litigation, with American lawyers often acquiring portions of the grants as payment for their services. Many California families lost all or most of their land through this process. American settlers, meanwhile, claimed that much of California was public land open to settlement under various land laws. Squatters occupied disputed lands, sometimes violently resisting attempts to remove them. The conflicts between landholders and squatters sometimes escalated to armed confrontations. The legal and political battles over land would continue for decades, but by the late 1850s, the pattern was clear. The old California landowning class was being displaced by American farmers, ranchers, and speculators. Transportation improvements changed California significantly. Roads were improved and bridges built over rivers that had previously been crossed by ferry or ford. Stagecoach lines established regular service connecting San Francisco with the mining regions and with Southern California. The mail service became more reliable, with regular overland mail to the east and coastal steamer service. The establishment of the Pony Express in 1860, though it lasted only 18 months before being made obsolete by the telegraph, captured popular imagination and demonstrated that rapid cross-country communication was possible. The telegraph reached California in 1861, suddenly connecting the states to the rest of the nation almost instantaneously. This connection reduced California's isolation and integrated it more fully into the national economy and political system. The religious landscape of California diversified through the 1850s. Catholic churches served the Californio and immigrant Irish populations, as well as converts from other groups. Protestant denominations established congregations and built churches. Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Episcopalians all competed for members and influence. The Mormon presence in California was significant, particularly in San Bernardino, where a Mormon colony was established, though many Mormons would later return to Utah. Jewish immigrants, many from Germany, established synagogues in San Francisco and Sacramento. Chinese immigrants brought Buddhist and Taoist temples, practices that most Americans knew little about and often misunderstood. The religious diversity of California was remarkable for the period and contributed to a culture of relative tolerance, though this tolerance had clear limits, particularly regarding non-Christian religions. Cultural institutions developed as California matured. Libraries, literary societies, and debating clubs formed in the larger towns. Newspapers proliferated, with nearly every town of any size supporting at least one paper. These papers served not just as news sources, but as platforms for literary expression, with serialized novels, poetry, and essays appearing regularly. The arts found support in Gold Rush, California. Photographers established studios, capturing images of miners, mining operations, and California landscapes. These photographs provide invaluable documentation of the Gold Rush era. Painters produced portraits, landscapes, and scenes of mining life. Some of these works were strictly commercial. Others had artistic merit and helped shape how Americans visualized California and the West. Architecture evolved from the purely functional to something more ambitious. The early canvas tents and rough wooden shacks gave way to more substantial buildings. San Francisco saw the construction of increasingly impressive commercial and institutional buildings. Theaters, hotels, and commercial blocks were built with attention to aesthetic considerations, not just function. The development of San Francisco's built environment through the 1850s reflected the city's growing wealth and aspirations to be recognized as a major American city. The environmental impact of gold mining became increasingly apparent by the mid-1850s. The hydraulic mining operations were stripping away entire hillsides. The mercury used in gold processing was poisoning waterways. The silt from mining operations was choking rivers and causing flooding in agricultural areas. These impacts led to growing conflicts between miners and farmers, conflicts that would intensify in the following decades and eventually result in legal restrictions on hydraulic mining. The transformation of California's landscape went beyond the direct effects of mining. Forests were cut for lumber to build cities, mines, and flumes. Grasslands were converted to agriculture. Rivers were diverted for irrigation. The introduction of European livestock and plants changed ecosystems. The overall impact was a rapid and dramatic transformation of the California environment, setting patterns that would continue throughout California's development. The gold rush was also changing culturally and psychologically. The early years had been characterized by a sense of limitless opportunity, a feeling that anyone might strike it rich at any moment. But by the mid-1850s, this optimism was tempered by the reality that most miners were not finding fortunes. The get-rich-quick dreams were giving way to more modest ambitions of steady employment and gradual accumulation. This shift affected how people thought about California and their futures there. Some miners, disappointed in their quest for gold, but attracted to California's climate and opportunities in other fields, transitioned to other occupations. They became farmers, merchants, craftsmen, or labourers. For them, California became home rather than a temporary stopping place on the way to fortune. Others, unable to adjust to the new reality or unwilling to abandon their dreams of striking it rich, moved on to new mining rushes. When gold was discovered in Nevada, in Colorado, in Idaho, and later in other locations, these veteran prospectors packed up and moved on, chasing the dream to new frontiers. They became a kind of permanent prospecting class, always moving, always hoping the next strike would be the big one. Still others admitted defeat and returned home, if they had the means to do so. These returnees had complex experiences to process. Some had lost everything and returned in poverty, embarrassed by their failure. Others had made modest accumulations and were content to return to their former lives with a stake to invest in land or business. A few returned with real wealth, local heroes who had succeeded in the great adventure. The gold rush was entering its final phase. The total gold production from California peaked in 1852 at about $81 million worth of gold. Production remained high through 1854, but began a gradual decline thereafter. The era of the solitary miner panning for gold was ending, giving way to the era of industrial mining companies and wage labour. California was transitioning from gold rush frontier to settled state. Part 9. Legacy and Conclusion. As we reach the end of our journey through the California Gold Rush from 1848 to 1855, it's worth reflecting on the profound and lasting impacts of this extraordinary event. The Gold Rush transformed California, transformed the United States, and had effects that rippled across the world. Its legacy continues to shape California and American culture to this day. The most immediate and obvious impact was the rapid settlement of California. In the span of just a few years, California went from a remote, sparsely populated backwater to a state with a significant population and a major city in San Francisco. This transformation occurred far more rapidly than the gradual westward expansion that had characterized American settlement patterns previously. The gold rush demonstrated that under the right circumstances, migration could happen on a massive scale in a very short time. The demographic impact extended beyond just numbers. The gold rush brought together people from around the world in unprecedented diversity. While the interactions between different ethnic and racial groups were often marked by conflict and discrimination, the gold rush did create a more cosmopolitan society than existed elsewhere in the American West. The presence of large Chinese, Hispanic, and European immigrant populations gave California a distinctive character. Economically, the gold rush had multiple effects. Most obviously, it injected enormous amounts of gold into the American and world economies. California gold helped finance the Union side in the Civil War, supported American industrial expansion, and contributed to global economic growth. The total value of gold extracted from California in the 19th century was approximately $2 billion, equivalent to many tens of billions in modern currency. But the economic impact went beyond the gold itself. The gold rush stimulated the development of California's infrastructure, its agriculture, and its commercial sectors. It created San Francisco as a major port and financial center. It drove improvements in transportation, both within California and connecting California to the rest of the nation. The wealth generated by gold provided capital for investment in other enterprises, helping California develop a diversified economy. The gold rush had significant impacts on American capitalism and business organization. The transition from individual mining to corporate mining companies presaged the rise of corporate capitalism in other industries. The mining stock market in San Francisco was an early example of speculative finance capitalism. The development of complex water rights and mining law established legal frameworks that would influence resource development throughout the West. Technologically, the gold rush drove innovations in mining, transportation, and communication. Techniques developed in the California gold fields, particularly hydraulic mining and hard rock mining methods, would be applied in mining rushes elsewhere. The demand for rapid communication stimulated improvements in mail service and eventually contributed to the development of the transcontinental telegraph and railroad. The environmental legacy of the gold rush is largely negative. The physical scars of hydraulic mining are still visible in the California landscape more than a century and a half later. Mercury pollution from gold processing continues to affect waterways and wildlife. The rapid deforestation, soil erosion, and disruption of watersheds had long-lasting ecological impacts. The gold rush established a pattern of intensive resource extraction with little regard for environmental consequences, a pattern that would be repeated in other mining regions and other industries. For Native Americans, the gold rush was catastrophic. The indigenous population of California declined from perhaps 300,000 before the gold rush to approximately 30,000 by 1900, one of the most severe population collapses in human history. This was caused by disease, starvation as traditional food sources were destroyed, and outright violence. The gold rush accelerated the dispossession of native peoples from their lands and the destruction of their cultures. Some tribes were completely eliminated. This tragic legacy is one of the darkest aspects of the gold rush story. The gold rush's impact on American culture and mythology has been profound and lasting. It reinforced the idea of the West as a land of opportunity where anyone could reinvent themselves and achieve success through individual effort. The image of the lone prospector seeking fortune became an enduring symbol of American individualism and ambition. While the reality was more complex and often disappointing, the myth proved powerful and persistent. The 49er became an iconic American figure, celebrated in literature, art, and eventually film and television. The gold rush inspired countless stories, novels, poems, and songs. Writers like Bret Harte and Mark Twain drew on gold rush experiences and settings for their work, helping to create a distinctively American literature. The gold rush became part of American folklore, with tales of lucky strikes, colourful characters, and frontier justice becoming part of the national narrative. The gold rush also influenced American attitudes toward immigration and ethnic diversity in complex ways. On one hand, the success of immigrants from various countries demonstrated that opportunity in America was not limited to native-born citizens. On the other hand, the discrimination and violence directed at Chinese, Mexican, and other non-white groups revealed the limits of American tolerance and the persistence of racial prejudice. The political impacts of the gold rush extended well beyond California. The rapid admission of California as a free state disrupted the sectional balance in Congress and contributed to the growing tensions over slavery that would lead to the Civil War. California's 2 senators and its representatives gave the free states additional political power, changing the dynamics of national politics. The gold rush also influenced American foreign policy and territorial ambitions. The valuable acquisition of California vindicated, in the eyes of many Americans, the Mexican-American War and the concept of manifest destiny. It encouraged further expansion, contributing to American interest in Alaska, purchased from Russia in 1867, and in Pacific territories like Hawaii. For California itself, the gold rush set the state on a trajectory of rapid growth and development that continued long after the gold fever subsided. The population and wealth attracted by gold became the foundation for California's development as an agricultural powerhouse, a center of innovation and industry, and eventually the most populous state in the nation. Many of the state's major cities, including San Francisco, Sacramento, and Stockton, owe their existence or early growth to the gold rush. The gold rush also established certain characteristics of California culture that persist: an openness to newcomers, an entrepreneurial spirit, a tolerance for risk-taking and reinvention, and a certain restlessness and optimism. Whether these traits are truly distinctive to California or simply stereotypes is debatable, but the connection between these cultural characteristics and the gold rush experience is widely perceived. The lessons of the gold rush are multiple and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, it demonstrated the power of individual ambition and effort. Many people did improve their circumstances through participating in the gold rush, even if they didn't strike it rich. The gold rush created opportunities for social mobility and allowed people to escape the limitations of their backgrounds. On the other hand, the gold rush demonstrated the power of luck and circumstance. Success depended heavily on when one arrived in California, what information one had, and simple chance. Hard work was no guarantee of success, and many of the hardest working miners ended up with little or nothing to show for their efforts. The gold rush could be seen as validating American myths about opportunity and self-made success, or as revealing those myths to be partly illusory. The gold rush also illustrated the double-edged nature of rapid economic development. While it created wealth and opportunity for many, it also caused environmental destruction, social disruption, and suffering for vulnerable populations. The benefits and costs were not evenly distributed, with some groups benefiting greatly while others, particularly Native Americans, paid a terrible price. As California approaches the 200th anniversary of the gold rush, the event continues to fascinate and to raise questions about American history and values. Museums, historic sites, and educational programs work to preserve and interpret gold rush history. Historians continue to research and debate aspects of the gold rush, bringing new perspectives and uncovering new stories. Recent scholarship has particularly focused on recovering the experiences of groups whose stories were long marginalized: Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, African Americans, women, and Hispanic miners. This work has created a more complete and more complicated picture of the gold rush than the traditional narrative focused on American male miners. The question of how to remember and commemorate the gold rush remains contentious. Should it be celebrated as a pivotal moment in California and American development, or should the emphasis be on the negative consequences, particularly for native peoples? Most historians would argue for a balanced approach that acknowledges both the transformative economic and social changes brought by the gold rush and the terrible costs paid by some groups. The gold rush remains relevant in understanding contemporary California and America, the state's continuing diversity, its attraction for immigrants and internal migrants seeking opportunity, its boom and bust economic cycles, and its environmental challenges all have roots in the gold rush era. The tension between resource extraction and environmental protection, between rapid development and preservation, between welcoming newcomers and anti-immigrant sentiment, all of these issues that California continues to grapple with have echoes in gold rush history. For those who participated in the gold rush, the experience was life-defining. Whether they struck it rich or went broke, whether they stayed in California or returned home, whether they looked back on it with pride or regret, the gold rush was the great adventure of their lives. They had participated in one of the great migrations of human history, had witnessed the transformation of a remote territory into a thriving state, and had been part of an event that would be remembered and studied for generations. As we conclude our exploration of the California Gold Rush, we're left with an event that was at once a historical turning point, an economic phenomenon, a human drama, an environmental disaster, and a cultural touchstone. It was a moment when individual ambitions, national expansion, technological development, ethnic conflict, environmental transformation, and simple greed and hope combined to create something unprecedented. The story of James Marshall finding those first flakes of gold in the American River on January 24th, 1848, set in motion a chain of events that would touch hundreds of thousands of lives, reshape a vast landscape, transform a region, and contribute to the emergence of the United States as a continental and eventually global power. It demonstrated both the extraordinary capacity of human beings to endure hardship in pursuit of their dreams, and the often tragic consequences of unchecked ambition and rapid, unplanned development. For the native peoples of California, the gold rush was an unmitigated catastrophe, bringing disease, violence, and dispossession on a genocidal scale. For the Chinese immigrants who came seeking opportunity, it brought both economic advancement and violent discrimination. For Hispanic miners from Mexico and South America, it brought a complex mix of recognition of their mining expertise and racist exclusion. For women, it brought both expanded economic opportunities and exploitation. For the American miners who formed the majority of gold seekers, the results were highly variable. A few struck it rich and returned home or stayed in California as wealthy men. Many more made modest gains, enough perhaps to buy a farm or establish a business. Still more barely broke even or lost everything, returning home disappointed or becoming part of California's working class. A significant number never returned home at all, dying in California from disease, accidents, or violence. Yet, despite the hardships, the disappointments, and the often terrible costs, the gold rush retained a hold on the American imagination. It represented a moment when anything seemed possible, when ordinary people had the chance, however slim, to transform their lives dramatically. The myth of the gold rush, of instant wealth waiting to be discovered, of new beginnings in a new land, proved more powerful and enduring than the reality. This myth would be repeated in subsequent gold rushes and mining booms throughout the West, and in other forms of speculation and entrepreneurship. The California Gold Rush established a template that would be followed again and again. The rush to a new opportunity, the initial successes, the flood of newcomers, the competition, the winnowing of winners and losers, and eventually the transition to more organized and capitalized enterprise. Understanding the California Gold Rush requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. We must see it as those who participated in it saw it, an opportunity, an adventure, a chance at wealth, and a new life. We must also see it with historical perspective, as a moment of economic transformation, environmental degradation, cultural collision, and uneven development. We must acknowledge both its role in building California and the American West, and the terrible costs paid by those who were displaced or exploited in the process. The gold rush was fundamentally about human hope and greed, about the dream of a better life, and the willingness to endure extraordinary hardship to pursue that dream. It revealed both admirable and deplorable aspects of human nature, courage and cowardice, generosity and selfishness, cooperation and conflict, innovation and destruction. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself in a mining camp in the Sierra foothills in 1850. Around you are men from a dozen nations, speaking a dozen languages. You can hear the sound of water running through sluice boxes, the clang of metal on rock, the voices of miners calling to one another. The sun is setting behind the mountains, and the air is cooling after a hot day. You're exhausted from a day of back-breaking work, and your back aches, your hands are raw, and you're not sure whether you've found enough gold today to justify the effort. Tomorrow you'll wake before dawn and do it all again, still hoping that tomorrow will be the day you hit the mother lode, still dreaming of the life you'll build with your fortune, still connected by that dream to the tens of thousands of other dreamers scattered across the California goldfields. You're part of something extraordinary, a moment of transformation, and even though you can't fully see it yet, your presence here is helping to build a new California and a new America. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the California Gold Rush, from the first discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848 through the transformation of California by 1855. This has been Sleepless History. May your dreams tonight be rich with the gold of interesting history, and may you rest well knowing you've explored one of the most fascinating periods in American history. Good night